Chapter 8, Techniques Used to Memorize in Judaism. In this chapter, we want to explore the different memorization techniques used in Judaism from the biblical, rabbinic, medieval, and modern periods. In doing so, we want to observe which techniques were unique to which periods and which may have transcended to the other periods. Let us try and get into the mindset of the ancients and consider the mnemonic tools they had at their disposal to accomplish such great memorization feats. Memorization techniques in the biblical period. Alphabetic acrostic. The writers of the Bible used such common knowledge as the alphabet as an aid to memorizing portions of the Bible. In an acrostic poem, the first letter of each line follows in alphabetic sequence. A person memorizing such a text would have an easier time recalling the sequence of lines, being able to follow the alphabet memorized first in their primary education. Such acrostics represent one strategy that alphabetic cultures used to cope with the problem of keeping memorized bits of tradition in the correct sequence. The following are some alphabetic acrostics that occur in the Bible. Nahum chapter 1, Psalms 9, 10, 25, 34, to name a few, Proverbs chapter 31, and Lamentations 1 through 4. Key words. Another mnemonic method for unifying individual sections of a text is the idea of putting stress on prominent key words to help the memory. This technique of repetition is characteristic of the oral style and was developed in Hebrew literature into a creative literary device. This form of composition is known in the Psalms, where the reoccurrence of key words is a basic law of oral style. The repetition of key words enables the listener and reader to provide a thread of continuity which will serve to bind the train of thought together in the process of memorization. For example, there are 8 key words in Psalm 119, and most of the lines of the poem contain one of these 8 words. Lists. Lists rely on repetitive formulas that the memory appreciates. For example, such lists, or genealogies as Genesis 5 and 11, use a repetitive formula to aid memorization. Meter. Texts constructed in metrical form are more easily committed to memory and are one reason why ancient poetry could be transmitted relatively unchanged over long periods. Music. Israel had a strong musical tradition, as is attested by the large variety of technical terms associated with music making in the Bible. Although there is no direct testimony that poets recited stories to the strains of music, there are psalms of the Bible that clearly state the text was originally supposed to be set to music, such as Habakkuk chapter 3. As we know, language when sung differs from ordinary spoken language, which in turn affects the traditions of meter. For example, they chant to the sound of the viol and invent to themselves instruments of music like David, Amos 6:5. Numerical aids. The 10 generations from Adam to Noah, the 10 Commandments, or the 10 plagues of Egypt are an example of teaching structured for memorization. The ordering of the list into 10 items allows the student to use their fingers to count off and see whether they have counted all of the key points of these fundamental teachings everyone should know by heart. Numerology. The number 8 has an important place in biblical numerology in regards to alphabetic acrostic poems. For example, each stanza of Psalm 119 has 8 lines. There are also 8 key nouns in the psalm, corresponding to the 8 lines in each stanza of the poem to aid memorization. Opening formulas. Another mnemonic device tied together unrelated statements by providing them identical opening formulas to help remember them. An example is found in Amos chapter 1. For 3 transgressions, yea, for 4. Parallelism. A basic feature of biblical songs, sayings, proverbs is the recurrent use of a relatively short sentence form that consists of 2 brief clauses. The clauses are regularly separated by a slight pause because the second line is usually a continuation of the first. This kind of style would facilitate the poet's composition of verses and at the same time make memorization easier for the author and audience. The parallel word pair is used in the same verse with one member of the pair in the first line and the second member in the parallel line. For example, like snow in summer and like rain in harvest. Proverbs 26:1. Repetition. As we mentioned earlier, Deuteronomy 6:7 does not refer to discussion or teaching of the interpretation of the words as often implied by the translations today. Instead, it commands a constant process of recitation of the actual memorized words of the Torah during all activities of the waking day. The process envisioned here is one of self and child Torah education through constant vocal repetition. As we have traced throughout this book, verbal repetition was the most facilitated memorization tool in Judaism in all periods. Rhythm. Rhythm can be described as a recurring pattern of sounds. The mind insists on grouping and highlighting the repetition of identical sounds. The listener is predisposed for rhythmic sequences, especially when listening to poetry. Rhythm can be marked by loudness, by pitch, and by length. Similar incidents. To employ a series of similar incidents was also an aid to the memory. An example of this is the stations Israel stopped at during their wanderings after the Exodus. And they removed from Elam and encamped by the Red Sea. And they removed from the Red Sea and encamped in the wilderness of Zin. And they took their journey out of the wilderness of Zin, and so on. Numbers 33. Sing-song. As we know, there is no better way to memorize a text than to sing it. The pedagogical connections of Isaiah chapter 28 indicate that Isaiah's opponents are sarcastically charging him with speaking to them as a speaker speaks to the school children. Who will he teach knowledge, and to whom will he explain the message? Those who are weaned from milk, those taken from the breasts? Isaiah's opponents go on to quote what appears to be a sing-song used in an 8th century educational context to facilitate memorization. Command to command, command to command, line to line, line to line, there a little, there a little. This seeming phrase is modeled on a pattern of call and response based on the middle part of the Hebrew alphabet. Following a call and response pattern, the teacher would say something like line to line, and the students would echo him. This text provides a picture of an ancient alphabetically based process of call and response to aid the memory. Song. Some texts depict a process of oral instruction that requires memorization. For example, the Song of Moses is instructed to be taught orally to the people. Write this song and teach it to the Israelites. Put it in their mouths. And in another place, David's lament over Jonathan says, David ordered that the song of the bow be taught to the men of Judah. Straightforward patterns. The function of this pattern, among other reasons, was to alleviate the process of memorization of the text. An example of this is found in Jeremiah 48. On every pair of hands a slash, on every pair of hips a sackcloth, female, female, male, male. Memorization techniques in the rabbinic and medieval periods. As we mentioned earlier, when we arrived to the time when the oral canon of the Talmud was to be closed, there existed numerous teachings to aid in the memorization of the oral and written Torah. Let us investigate some of the popular mnemonics used in these periods and observe if any of the mnemonic techniques used in the biblical period transcended into the rabbinic and medieval periods, as well as notice new techniques which fostered memorization. Brevity. We see the emphasis on brevity not only in ancient Judaism, but through the rabbinic period. The tendency was to concentrate teachings and texts and express them with the utmost brevity. We saw this example earlier in lectures given on Shabbat. There was a very active consciousness of the importance of such concentration, of condensing material into concise, pregnant, and, if possible, also striking sayings that would aid the memorization. A sharp peppercorn is better than a basket of gourds. The well-thought-out brief statement was the ideal maxim, but the rule enjoining a teacher to teach in the shortest way was not primarily intended as a general recommendation to brevity. It was intended to stress the importance of a teacher formulating as concisely as possible the important doctrinal statements, those which were intended as condensed memory verses. Catchphrases. By their nature, these are pithy mnemonic statements in which the element of apparent paradox is often used. To remember that meditating on sin can be worse than its actual commission, the mnemonic was devised, the order of meat, i.e., the order of the meat excites the appetite more than the meat itself. Image. It was suggested that students form an image of the rabbi who had issued a rule even as they memorized that rule, thus fulfilling the requirement that a rule be cited in the name of its designer. This was a Jewish version of a Greco-Roman memorization technique from the text Ad Horinum. The author, a teacher of rhetoric, believed that since sight is the strongest of the senses, the best way to fix something in the memory is to associate it with a place and with objects that can be easily recalled. The author suggests the student mentally walk through a room and fix in their mind the shape of the room and the placement of objects. When the student would memorize a text, they should associate the various ideas of the text with the room and its objects. To recall the speech, one would walk through the room and among the furnishings of their mind. The rabbis seem to have used a written text as the Romans a mental room. Paragraphs, words, and letters became keys to memory. The phrases and letters stood for a place and its objects. The places were like tablets or paper, the images like the letters, the arrangement and disposition of the images like the script, and the delivery was like reading. Initial letters. Another type of mnemonic consisted merely of the initial letters of words in a list. A well-known example is the mnemonic for the 10 plagues. The Midrash states that it was engraved on the staff of Moses. Another example is the mnemonic for the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which have a final form. The medieval grammarians similarly made a mnemonic for the 6 letters which take a dagesh. Meditation. Meditation is the process by which one ruminates over the memorized word. This process, as we earlier saw from Joshua 1:8, is the exercise which causes one to think upon the memorized word and makes one act wisely. The best time for such meditation was considered to be at midnight or before dawn. Rabbi Abraham found allusions for this in such verses as Lamentations 2:19 and Psalm 119, 148. Numbers. Numbers were also helpful in memorizing. For example, 3 things must a man say within his house when darkness is descending on the eve of Sabbath. Popular proverbs. The wealthy Simon ben Judah Hanasi was of the opinion that a certain defect in an animal did not render the animal invalid, and he ate its meat, while the poor Rabbi Haya discarded it as invalid. They had a similar disagreement about the use of oil for the temple. In both cases, a mnemonic was devised into a popular proverb. The wealthy are frugal. Repeating aloud. We frequently see in rabbinic literature the importance that repetition of memorized texts and oral teachings should be carried out in a distinct voice to aid memorization. Let your ears hear what you allow to cross your lips. We read that Rabbi Judah ben Batra saw a pupil mumbling and said to him, "My son, open your mouth and let your words shine forth." This account was given as a general example of the way in which one of Rabbi Eliezer's pupils repeated in a whisper, as a result of which he forgot everything he memorized in 3 years. The rabbis directly oppose any tendency towards silent reading and silent repetition. Review. To aid memorization, nothing was found more helpful than frequent reviews. While this is of particular importance to the study of the oral Torah, it applies also to the study of the Bible, as we earlier read concerning the Return to Zion Yeshiva today. The Talmud waxes eloquent on this subject and illustrates it in a number of times. Even to study continuously new subjects without making sure that the old ones are not forgotten would nearly defeat the purpose. In doing so, one would resemble a man who sows but does not reap, or a woman who bears children and buries them. The rabbis did not propose any set number of reviews necessary to remember a lesson. As a general rule, they believed the more repetitions, the better the possibility to memorize. Rabbi Hillel said, "You cannot compare one who studies his lesson 100 times to one who studies it 101 times." Rhythm. Intimately connected with the custom of reading and repeating aloud was the practice of reciting with a rhythmical melody. Rhythm fulfills a pedagogical function. The texts which are learned in this way are memorized and transmitted more exactly than those learned in other ways. A well-known saying of Rabbi Yohanan reads, "He who reads the scriptures without melody and repeats the oral Torah without song, concerning himself the scripture says, therefore I also gave them statutes which were not to their advantage." Sing-song. The Talmud stresses the desirability of memorizing in a sing-song fashion. Rabbi Akiva put it this way: "A song each day, a song each day." A different translation is, "Sing it! Sing it!" Memorization techniques in the modern period. In my interviews with individuals in different streams of Judaism in Jerusalem, I have come to the conclusion that there are some methods for memorizing today that have been handed down from antiquity, But many of the above-mentioned methods used during the previous periods are not directly utilized today. The following methods seem to be utilized today. Hevruta. A method used in the yeshiva world today is the exercise of finding a hevruta, or partner, and memorizing and reviewing together. As mentioned earlier, this process includes two individuals sitting across from each other while both having their texts under review open. Each individual quotes a particular portion from memory while not looking at the text. If either one draws a blank, they rely either on the written text or their partner to remind them of the memorized text under consideration. Public reading. The most utilized technique of memorizing today is by the often heard public reading of the prayers in the Torah in the daily synagogue service, whereby spoken, written texts become hidden in the heart of the hearer by their constant exposure. By hearing and reading the same portion so many times for year after year, there develops an intimacy and a degree of verbatim memorization. Song. In the world of the synagogue, the best available mnemonic is the song. Such biblical texts or prayers put to music increase the ability for that text to be memorized by the audience. Verbal repetition. Another method is similar to the song but different. Consistent verbal repetition. I would consider this exercise more individualistic than communal. This same exercise, so prevalent in the rabbinic period, is still considered today to be the most reliable and utilized tool for memorizing Torah and Jewish thought and practice. Conclusion, Chapter 8. Lying underneath the surface of the oral and written Torah are numerous mnemonic devices deliberately designed by the authors to aid the hearer or reader in memorization, and are not usually evident, unfortunately, in translations. Not only did the words and format of portions of the Torah aid in memorization, but the Jewish people developed over the millennia scores of mnemonic techniques to facilitate memorization. These memorization aids helped place the oral and written tradition on the forefront of the minds of the Jewish people and assisted them in transmitting their oral tradition for ages. As we have seen, there were numerous mnemonic techniques available to memorize in Judaism over the ages. Some of the techniques were more difficult than others and required a previous knowledge of the memorized written Torah to facilitate them. Yet, others were quite simple in nature and would be available to implement by any person. Of the over 30 memorization techniques I have listed, which is by no means exhaustive, we can glimpse the admiration that the oral world of Judaism put on the memorization and recitation of the oral and written Torah during all periods.